Good morning and welcome. On behalf of the Rosendale Theater and Citron, who is getting ready to cut a cake soon for you all, two beautiful cakes. If my face is unfamiliar to you, you haven't been to the theater in the last year on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday night, I'm in the box office. Best job I ever had. Started as a volunteer. Anyway, my pleasure and distinct honor is to introduce you to your hosts for today's reading of the Declaration. To my right, Anita Williams-Peck, you all know, I'm sure, who is a board member of the Rosendale Theater, and Lori Childers, who's up on stage in front of the lectern, the publisher of the Bluestone Press, who continually gives her support to the theater and to things that we do. So once again, happy 4th to you all. My pleasure, Anita Peck.
Good morning, everyone. We have a full house here. Great to see all you people come out for this really fantastic event. It is the 6th annual reading of the Declaration of Independence at this theater. And we have to thank Edward Schroeder for all the work he does to make this happen. He's not with us today. He has a family event to go to, but he put this all together. Without him, we would not be here today. So I just want to mention this Rosendale Theater has been operating based for a not-for-profit organization since 2010 for 8 years. And we are doing well. Thanks to the donors, thanks to the volunteers, and thanks to all of you who come to the theater. It's just beautiful, this theater. I love it. Anyway, today, why do we gather? We gather to give tribute to the magnificent document that led to the making of the United States of America. A document written in 1776 that still to this day expresses the values and aspirations of the American people. First, we will read the Declaration of Independence. Then Chelsea Miller will read Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments, which made its debut on July 4th, 1848. Then today's event will culminate with music provided by the Rosendale Improvement Association Brass Band and Social Club, and we'll conclude with refreshments in the lobby. So we would like to thank the sponsor of this event, Bluestone Press, and Lori. Thank you so much. And the Rosendale Cafe for baking such a magnificent cake for us to enjoy. And this event wouldn't happen without the 20 readers we have on stage. So we thank you all. And we'd like to thank the Association Bass Brand and Social Club and all the volunteers that would comprise the Rosendale Theater Collective. And now I'd like to introduce Lawyer, our sponsor, Lori.
It's a great honor for the Bluestone Press to sponsor this event every year. A newspaper is a logbook of the successes and the failures of a free people. Every meeting we report on is a practical extension of the Declaration of Independence, where the members of the community govern themselves. And there are very few places in the world where this is the way of life. With freedom comes the chance that some will succeed and some will fail. It's the responsibility of everybody in a free society to help everyone they know to succeed and let nobody know fail. These readers were selected by a committee and invited to participate based on their community engagement, service, and dedication. Let's give them a round of applause. I'm going to introduce them now. Carrie Wyckoff, coming from left to right. Founder of Events That Matter, Rosendale Street Festival volunteer, and board member of the Rosendale Theater. Charles Teduni, Roundout Valley Junior High School principal, and New York State Middle School Principal of the Year. Mary Louise Johnson, physician, teacher, and philanthropist. Kenneth Johnson, physician and husband of Mary Louise. Lucy Winsong Rain, Rosendale Theater's #1 volunteer. John Wackman, founder of Repair Cafe and member of Rosendale Theater's programming committee. Helena Naliwaco, a student from Roundout Valley School, an incoming high school student. Etsuko Hizawa, who's the owner of Soy Restaurant here on Main Street in Rosendale. Richard Lanzarone, former chair, longtime chair of the Marbletown Planning Board. Brian Matthews, president of the Rosendale Theater. And then right behind Robert, we have Robert Sudlow, Ulster County Deputy Executive, who just retired on May 31st. Lynn Archer, Ulster County Legislature and Realtor. Alexa Peck, a student from Kingston High School. Judy Hauser, co-founder of Vision Pilots and member of the Roundout Valley Education Foundation. Matthew Igo, Rosendale Town Board member and Army veteran. Reverend Allison J. Quinn, pastor of Christ the King Church. Snapper Earl, a stalwart Rosendale Theater volunteer. Mary Summer, Roundout Valley High School, class of 2018. Christopher Smith, Coleman High School, salutatorian, class of 2018. And Ethan King, Roundout Valley student, also entering high school next year.
From a letter by John Adams to Abigail Adams, July 3rd, 1776. This day will be the most memorable in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. From this time forward, forevermore. You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet, through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that in the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction, even although we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not. In Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and the laws of God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments, long established, should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experiences have shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by the abolishing of the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only.
He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people.
He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. The state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within.
He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out of their substance.
He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, given his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states.
For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the absolute rule into these colonies.
For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us.
He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with the circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands.
He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people.
Nor have we been wanting in the attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. We have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence.
They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends.
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states.
That they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do.
And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Button Gwinnett, Georgia.
Lyman Hall, Georgia.
George Walton, Georgia.
William Hooper, North Carolina.
Joseph Hughes, North Carolina.
John Penn, North Carolina.
Edward Ludwig, South Carolina.
Thomas Haywood Jr., South Carolina.
Thomas Lynch Jr., South Carolina.
Arthur Middleton, South Carolina.
John Hancock, Massachusetts.
Samuel Chase, Maryland.
William Paca, Maryland.
Thomas Stone, Maryland.
Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Maryland.
George Wythe, Virginia.
Richard Henry Lee, Virginia.
Thomas Jefferson, Virginia.
Benjamin Harrison, Virginia.
Thomas Nelson Jr., Virginia.
Francis Lightfoot Lee, Virginia.
Carter Braxton, Virginia.
Robert Morris, Pennsylvania.
Benjamin Rush, Pennsylvania.
Benjamin Franklin, Pennsylvania.
John Morton, Pennsylvania.
George Clymer, Pennsylvania.
James Smith, Pennsylvania.
George Taylor, Pennsylvania.
James Wilson, Pennsylvania.
George Ross, Pennsylvania.
Caesar Rodney, Delaware.
George Reed, Delaware.
Thomas McKean, Delaware.
William Floyd, New York.
Philip Livingston, New York.
Francis Lewis, New York.
Lewis Morris, New York.
Richard Stockton, New Jersey.
John Witherspoon, New Jersey.
Francis Hopkinson, New Jersey.
Abraham Clark, New Jersey.
John Hart, New Jersey.
Josiah Bartlett, New Hampshire.
William Whipple, New Hampshire.
Samuel Adams, Massachusetts.
Joan Adams, Massachusetts.
Robert Treat Payne, Massachusetts.
Elbridge Gerry, Massachusetts.
Stephen Hopkins, Rhode Island.
William Ellery, Rhode Island.
Roger Sherman, Connecticut.
Samuel Huntington, Connecticut.
William Williams, Connecticut.
Oliver Wolcott, Connecticut.
Larry Thornton, New Hampshire.
And this is our Declaration of Independence.
In 1848, a historic assembly of women gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton organized the Seneca Falls Convention with Lucretia Mott, who, like her, had been excluded from the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London 8 years earlier. Modeling her declaration closely on the Declaration of Independence, Stanton extended the list of grievances to women. The Declaration also called for the right for women to vote, a radical demand that helped launch the women's suffrage movement, leading ultimately to the recognition of voting rights in the 19th Amendment in 1920. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume, among the people of the earth, a position different from which they have hitherto occupied, but to one of which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare their causes that impel them to such a course. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with a certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their powers from the consent of those who are governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it, and to insist upon the institution of a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to effect the safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that the governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, perusing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them to absolute despotism, it is their duty to throw off such a government and provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of women under this government, and such is the new necessity that constrains them to demand equal station to which they are entitled. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to the candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of she has had no voice. He has withheld her from rights which are given to the most ignorant of men, both natives and foreigners. Having deprived her of this right, this first right as a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. He has made her, if married, in the eyes of the law, civilly dead. He has taken from her all right in property, even to the wages she earns. He has made her morally irresponsible, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they're done in the presence of her husband. In the convent of marriage, she is compelled to promise absolute obedience to her husband, he becoming, for all intent and purposes, her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of liberty and administer chastisement. He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be proper causes of divorce, in case of separation, to whom the guardianship of children shall be given, as to be wholly regardless of the happiness of women. The law, in all cases, going a false supposition to the supremacy of man, and giving all power to his hands. After depriving all the rights of a married woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. He has monopolized nearly every profitable form of employment, and she is permitted to follow, and from these she is permitted to follow. She receives but a scanty remuneration. He closes against her all avenues of wealth and distinction, which he considers most honorable himself. As a teacher of theology, as medicine or law, she is not known. He has denied her the faculties for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed to her. He allows her in church, as well as state, but in a subordinate position, claiming apostolic authority for her exclusion to the ministry, and with some exceptions, from any public participation in the church. He has created a false public sentiment by giving the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies which exclude women from society are not only tolerated, but deemed of little account for men. He has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it is his right to assign to her a sphere of action, which belongs to only her conscience and her God. He has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent life. Now, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half of the people in this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do themselves feel aggravated, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of the most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. In entering upon this great work before us, we anticipate no small amount of misconceptions, misrepresentation, and ridicule. But we shall use every instrumentality within our powers to effect our object. We shall employ agents, circulate tracts, petition the states and national legislature, and endeavor to enlist the pulpit and the press in our behalf. We hope that this convention will be followed by a series of conventions embracing every part of the country. Firmly relying upon the final triumph of the right and true, we do to this day affix our signatures to this declaration.
The word for the day is gratitude. Gratitude for our founders, gratitude to our readers and hosts, gratitude to the Bluestone Press, and now to our band. Thanks for coming.